In the early days of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as it's called in the United States, British colonial forces were experiencing setback after setback. After the massive failure of Braddock's expedition in 1755, which resulted in a devastating blow to the British morale in North America, command of all British forces would unknowingly fall to General William Shirley, and the remaining expeditions against the French planned in North America would become his responsibility. One of those expeditions, the Crown Point expedition, would lead to the largest battle yet seen on the North American continent. William Shirley was born on December 2nd, 1694, in Sussex, England. After practicing law in England for several years, he traveled to Boston, Massachusetts, where he was appointed Admiralty Judge. Eventually, in 1741, he became governor and helped plan the successful attack on the French Fort Louisbourg during King George's War in 1745. The good news for Shirley was that Lieutenant Colonel Robert Monckton's expedition in Nova Scotia, which was sanctioned earlier in 1754 by Braddock and Shirley, resulted in a major victory for the British by overwhelming the French forces. Monckton's force of 270 British regulars and Major John Winslow's command of 2,000 provincial troops from Boston had successfully taken both Fort Oswego and Gaspereau with minimal casualties. This, though proving hopeful for the British presence in North America, would lead to the controversial forced removal of the Acadians on August 10, 1755, when they refused to swear an oath of allegiance to the British Crown, causing the British to fear an attack from within their newly taken territory. Meanwhile, headquartered in New York with news of ongoing success in Nova Scotia and General Braddock's expedition seemingly going to plan, General Shirley and General Johnson began to move their forces and prepare their respected expeditions against the French. It's important to note that there were very few British regulars in the colonies in 1755, as an official declaration of war between the French and the British would not happen until 1756, and most of the fighting was to be done by militia and provincial regiments. General William Shirley's original planned expedition was to attack the French garrison at Fort Niagara after linking up with General Braddock's forces after they had destroyed Fort Duquesne at the Forks of Ohio. Since Edward Braddock's expedition ended in disaster, and his death wouldn't be confirmed until much later, Shirley would have to make do with the supplies and men he had. General William Johnson, at the same time, was tasked with assaulting the French at Crown Point by raising men from New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. General Johnson and Shirley did not see eye to eye and would form a nasty feud between them. This was only exacerbated by the unclear chain of command set up by Edward Braddock before his departure. This would help result in the eventual failure of Shirley's Niagara expedition. Johnson was born in County Meath, Ireland in 1715. He came to the colonies in 1738 to manage 14,000 acres of land and a frontier trading post owned by his uncle, Peter Warren, a notable officer in the Royal Navy. During the years, Johnson oversaw his uncle's frontier store and began to understand how important and profitable it was to have good relations with the Native Americans. He would eventually adopt Mohawk culture and custom into his life. His relations with the natives was so well known that he would be appointed Commissary of Indian Affairs in New York in 1746, and later, during King George's War, he would be commissioned a colonel in His Majesty's forces to oversee the frontier defenses. This, combined with a great deal of friends in high places, would land him the position of Superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1754, and the following year a commission as a Major General tasked with the Crown Point expedition. It was Johnson's job to gather warriors from the northern tribes to aid the Crown Point and Niagara expeditions. However, General Shirley would instead appoint a corrupt merchant who was a close friend of his, John Henry Lydius, with recruiting native support for the Niagara expedition. Lydius was never on good terms with the natives and would find little success when competing with Johnson for native support. This, along with problems privately financing and supplying the expeditions, would only widen the rift between William Johnson and William Shirley. Eventually, when Shirley departed for Fort Oswego with his force of 1,600 men, comprising of the 1st New Jersey, 51st, and 50th Regiment of Foot, to stage and prepare the eventual attack on Fort Niagara, Johnson deemed that Shirley would not need any native support for his expedition, since he would be traveling through friendly territory. Shirley would be forced to find native support along the 250-mile march to Fort Oswego on his own. When Shirley and his men arrived at Fort Oswego on August 17, 1755, they found the fort in disarray and only garrisoned by a small, independent company from New York. This, along with an overextended supply line and little native support, would make the capture of Fort Niagara even more difficult. But the worst news was yet to come. Shirley had received word that 50 miles north of Oswego, another French fort, Fort Frontenac, was garrisoned by a force of French militia and natives equal to his own force. Not only that, but when General Braddock's men had retreated at the Battle of Monongahela, the French forces there had also captured plans for the British expeditions of 1755 and knew of Shirley's intentions of taking the well-supplied fort at Niagara. Later, Shirley, realizing his situation between a literal rock and a hard place, would make the decision not to advance onto Fort Niagara. Instead, he would leave 700 men to bolster the fort to prepare for an assault on Fort Niagara the following year. Shirley would then return to New York City to continue his work as Commander-in-Chief of all British forces. Unfortunately for his men that he left at Oswego, they would be left with little provisions and supply chain issues through the winter and would eventually be captured by Marquis de Montcalm in 1756 at the Battle of Oswego. But even before Shirley would set out on his failed expedition, General Johnson's expedition, unaware of Braddock's death, was already underway. Johnson had understood and interpreted his orders as to reduce the French presence at Crown Point, and if he was to fail in that task, to retreat to Albany and hold the city as long as possible. On July 17, 1755, Johnson issued his first order to advance to General Lyman. Lyman was given command of William's 3rd Massachusetts, Ruggles 1st Massachusetts, and the 1st Connecticut regiments, as well as 2 brass field pieces of artillery, and were to advance to the great carrying place to construct and, quote,
"Log magazines covered with bark, sufficient to contain and secure from the weather ammunitions, provisions belonging to the army."
Lyman's men were also given other orders to carry out along the march to the great carrying place in preparation for Johnson's main advance of the army. General Johnson would write to Lyman,
"Open the road 25 to 30 feet wide, where it will possibly admit of it, to have the trees, logs, and all obstructions cleared away, the stumps trimmed close, bridges well repaired where necessary, and good ones made where wanted. On the whole, as good a road made for carriage as possible. And besides, the officers who are over the workmen, you will please take a review yourself, as you are well apprised of the sudden and lurking attacks of the enemy. I make no doubt but you will dispose your troops and keep up such discipline amongst them, as well secure the whole body from any reproachful insults from the scout parties of the enemy."
Johnson, even though he was not a career military man, would recognize that all of Lyman's troops had never seen combat and were very green. He would further recommend General Lyman to
"Keep up as strict a discipline as circumstances will possibly admit of, to establish and preserve that due obedience, without which every kind of military undertaking be shameful and probably fatal."
On July 29, 1755, as Lyman's advance made its way to Saratoga, word began to come into Albany of Braddock's defeat at Monongahela. At first, Johnson would write to Lyman saying,
"There are reports of General Braddock's troops, and not favorable ones. I received a letter from New York, which tell me they look upon these reports as false, treacherous, and groundless."
Unfortunately, by August 1st, it was clear that the reports were in fact true, and would deal a devastating setback to the British military campaigns in North America. That same day, with General Lyman's 1st Division almost reaching the Great Carrying Place, Colonel Moss Titcomb was ordered to march the 2nd Division, comprised of the 2nd Connecticut, elements of the 3rd Massachusetts, and a massive artillery and supply train from Albany to the Great Carrying Place, now that Lyman's men had widened the road sufficient to move supplies for the army. Titcomb's column would begin their march north on August 6th. 3 days before Titcomb's 2nd Division would set out, Lyman's 1st Division arrived about 50 miles north of Albany at the Great Carrying Place. General Lyman would immediately set his men to work. The site the 1st Division had arrived at on the east side of the bend in the Hudson River was previously the site of Fort Nicholson during Queen Anne's War, and then later a fortified trading post owned by John Henry Lydius during King George's War. However, during a French raid sometime between 1744 and 1745, the trading post was destroyed. Now the site would be known as Fort Lyman, and later renamed Fort Edward. Over the next several days, scouts would report no French activity in the area. By August 12th, Lyman would send a work party north to begin work on a road for the main advance onto Crown Point. There were 2 possible routes considered. One would lead to Wood Creek and then on to Lake Champlain, and another route to Lake George, or as the French named it, Lac du Saint-Sacrement. Lyman, ever eager to advance, would order a road to be built to Wood Creek without asking Johnson. Johnson would arrive at the Great Carrying Place on August 14th, riding ahead of Titcomb's 2nd Division, along with his Mohawk allies. Johnson would place his main headquarters on an island in the middle of the Hudson, later called Rogers Island. Johnson, seeing that the terrain would pose a significant obstacle to the advance of his army to Crown Point, would order all work on the road to Wood Creek cease, and to explore other alternative routes. Eventually, the route to Lake George was chosen. At the same time, Captain Eyre, the only career British soldier in Johnson's army, who was also luckily spared a possible death at the Battle of Monongahela by being assigned to Johnson, would formally propose a plan to construct Fort Lyman. Johnson would approve of the plan. Construction of the fort would only take about a month, as Lyman's 1st Division had already done a good portion of the work before the plan was officially accepted. Johnson believed the fort would be crucial in defending the Hudson River, as well as a newly constructed road to Albany. By August 17th, all but the 1st New Hampshire had arrived at Fort Lyman. The 1st New Hampshire had originally been ordered to march on Crown Point directly through Vermont. However, after the path the regiment should take became unclear, they were redirected to march to Albany to await further orders from Johnson, and then eventually they were directed to Fort Lyman. A day before, on August 16th, the commander of the French forces sent to reinforce Canada, Baron de Descaux, arrived from Montreal at Fort St. Frederick, located at Crown Point. He would take command of the 550-man garrison there, along with 1,011 French regulars and 1,412 Canadians, and about 600 native allies. Descaux was born in 1701 in Saxony. Through his distinguished service, he eventually became a major general in the French army, and was named military governor of the French naval base in Brest, before being ordered to Canada. Unfortunately for him, the native allies he had at Crown Point were anything but cooperative. and would force Dieskau to rely on the Canadians for accurate information during scoutings. Eventually, by August 27th, Dieskau's Canadian scouts would report a large force of some 3,000 men at Fort Lyman, and were well advanced in building a formidable fort. With this information, Dieskau would move his army to Carolyn to prepare to engage Johnson's force and to stop his advance north. A few days later, on August 30th, Johnson's army and his close friend, Chief Hendrick, and 160 Mohawk warriors had arrived on the south shore of Lac du Saint-Sacrement and renamed it Lake George. There, William Eyre would plan the construction of what would eventually be known as Fort William Henry. Johnson would leave behind only a few companies of the 1st New York to garrison Fort Lyman and to await the 1st New Hampshire's arrival. By September 1st, Dieskau's Abenaki scouts had returned to Carillon with a prisoner from Fort Lyman, and upon interrogation, the French would learn that Fort Lyman was barely manned and vulnerable to attack. Dieskau would take 1,500 of his men and set out down Lake Champlain and into South Bay, and then set out overland and bushwhack to Fort Lyman as to avoid detection. However, when Dieskau's men were in striking distance of Fort Lyman, his native support for the offensive would dissolve and force Dieskau to call off the attack. That same day in Johnson's camp, Mohawk scouts had returned and reported French boats at South Bay and sporadic musket fire in the wilderness, along with reports of a hastily built road heading to Fort Lyman. Johnson realized Fort Lyman was in danger, quickly had his secretary write a dispatch to warn Joseph Blanchard, who had just arrived there with his 1st New Hampshire Regiment, of the French presence. A New Yorker by the name of Jacob Adams would volunteer to ride with haste to deliver the dispatch. As he rode swiftly down the military road Johnson's army had constructed, Adams would ride into Dieskau's army. Ignoring the danger all around him, Adams tried to push straight through, but would be dismounted by a French musket shot and killed. His dispatches now in the hands of the French. Johnson would learn of Adams' demise that night. Dieskau, now aware of Johnson's intent to send aid to Fort Lyman, would convene a council of war with his native allies, and they would vote to launch a surprise attack on Johnson's camp the following day. The next morning, on September 8th, Johnson would send a column south to aid Blanchard at Fort Lyman. Leading the way would be Chief Hendrick and his Mohawk warriors, followed by Ephraim Williams with his 3rd Massachusetts, and then Nathan Whitting with the 2nd Connecticut. As the relief column from Johnson's camp marched south, Baron de Dieskau's army was marching north on the same road when his scouts informed him of the column marching straight for them. Dieskau, seeing an opportunity, would set up an ambush that would later be called the Bloody Morning Scout. Dieskau placed his French regulars in line on the road to face the oncoming column, while placing Canadians in the woods to the right, and his native allies along the rocks and trees to the left. It was the perfect setup for the French. As the British advanced into the killing zone of the French-laid ambush, Chief Hendrick would halt the column upon hearing a noise from the woods. Dieskau's native allies, the Caughnawagas, would exchange warnings with Chief Hendrick, hoping to spare the Mohawks of the bloody battle about to unfold. Dieskau would call this, quote, the moment of treachery, for giving away the element of surprise. Hendrick would dismiss the warnings, and immediately after, musket fire began to erupt. Hendrick would be killed shortly after the first shots rang out. Chaos engulfed the road as the Canadians and French native allies continued to unload onto the Mohawks and the 3rd Massachusetts. Quickly, after the death of Chief Hendrick, the rest of the Mohawk warriors, demoralized by the death of their leader, would retreat and flee up the road back to Johnson's camp. The 3rd Massachusetts fared no better. While they did attempt to fire back and defend themselves in the storm of lead raining down on them, the concealed cover of the French forces and the continual musket fire would lead to massive losses for the regiment in the first few minutes of the engagement. With a majority of the regiment never experiencing combat before, fear would grip the men as they watched from out of nowhere as their comrades were gunned down and would flee at the sight back up the road as well. Colonel Ephraim Williams, seeing his regiment devolve into a desperate situation, would attempt to rally his troops, famously drawing his sword and stand upon a boulder on top of the embankment on the road, hoping to inspire his men. However, as soon as he stood atop that rock, he was shot in the head and died instantly. As the rest of his men retreated, a few of his soldiers would retrieve his body and hide it in an attempt to protect it from desecration from the enemy. Further north up the road, Nathan Whitting and the 2nd Connecticut had been spared the ambush as they had fallen slightly behind. As they continued down the road to the sound of musket fire, the retreating Mohawks in the 3rd Massachusetts made its way past them. Whitting knew something needed to be done. Dieskau's forces were now moving north and pursuing the British. Rallying what men he could from those fleeing, and along with his regiment, his force would engage the French, slowly retreating in orderly fashion while firing volleys. Whitting was able to delay the French and allow those fleeing to make it safely to Johnson's camp. Being only a few miles up the road, Johnson, in his camp, was able to hear musket fire, and soon survivors of the Bloody Morning Scout began to make their way into the camp. This worried Johnson. He ordered Edward Cole and a few men from the 1st Rhode Island to move out and reinforce the men down the road. Cole's men would link up with Whitting and assist in the delaying action. By the time Whitting and Cole's men were about a mile from Johnson's camp, they made a break for it and ran. The delaying action had worked. Johnson was able to organize and prepare the rest of his army by building breastworks, downing trees for cover around his encampment, and placing 2 heavy cannons pointing straight down the road in anticipation of the French advance. Dieskau, now half a mile from Johnson's position, halted his forces' advance and reorganized and redeployed his men. He knew that to carry the day, he would need to continue to push with all possible haste and engage the British. He would order his Canadian militia and native allies to the left and right of Johnson's camp, while his regulars with bayonets fixed would advance straight up the wagon road and meet the British force head-on. A little after noon, Dieskau was advancing again. As the French regulars advanced, Phineas Lyman would recall the sight and say, quote,
"Their arms glistened like the sun with their bayonets fixed and as confident, I suppose, of coming straight into our camp and carrying all before them, as ever any army was."
The French regulars would halt just out of range and fire by platoon. The British forces answered in kind with cannon, mowing down the regulars in vast numbers, forcing them to the tree line to find cover. Dieskau's Canadian and native troops, seeing a well-fortified British position and on top of the death of their commander, St. Pierre, earlier that morning, refused to advance the attack on Dieskau's order, and instead continued to fire from cover. Not only was Dieskau's situation turning unlucky, but so was William Johnson's. Within the first few moments of the attack on Johnson's camp, a musket ball had wounded his pride and his rear end. With Johnson being carried from the field to an aid station, command fell to Phineas Lyman. Lyman had the forethought during the beginning of the engagement to order the men to conserve ammunition, and he would remark later at how proud he was of the men, saying,
"Never men nor mortals fought better in the world."
However, not all of Johnson's officers would agree with Lyman's assessment. Peter Raxel later wrote that the men hid or faked illness to avoid fighting. The French regulars in the center continued to try to reform and attempt to advance, but were met with heavy cannon and musket fire each time. They continued to try to break through for the next 2 hours with no success. Dieskau, seeing the attack stalling, would shift his attention to the left and attempt to make his forces advance there. Captain Eyright, while commanding the artillery, saw the French forces shift and push to the left, and ordered that his cannons concentrate fire there. The cannonade, along with some mortars from inside the camp, would stall and hold back the new French advance. Trying to seize the moment, Moses Titcomb, seeing a better fighting position, tried to rally his men to advance, only to be struck and killed by Canadian musket fire. While trying to regroup for another assault, Dieskau learned that many of his native allies and Canadian militia had fled the battle and moved south down the road to loot the bodies from the morning's earlier engagement. As the afternoon wore on, Dieskau would organize one last push. This time, he would lead the attack in the field. While attempting to lead his troops in a clearing, Dieskau received a musket ball to his leg, knocking him to the ground. As he stood back up, he received yet another shot ripping through his knee and hip. Refusing to leave the field, Dieskau would order his second-in-command to reform the regulars and attack. Unfortunately, by that time, all of his militia and native support had retreated, and the regulars were in the process of retiring from the field. With the French forces retiring, the British would capture Dieskau, and unfortunately, as Dieskau reached for his pocket watch, a provincial soldier, thinking he was reaching for a pistol, would shoot Dieskau in the bladder. However, this would not kill him. Johnson, upon seeing Dieskau's position, ordered that his wounds be treated as they were serious. While being treated, Johnson also came to Dieskau's aid again, as several Mohawks were attempting to kill the French commander. By persuading the natives against such an act and posting guards outside Dieskau's tent, he averted the killing. Though the main battle for Lake George was now over, and Johnson's men were treating the wounded and burying the dead, another bloody battle was beginning. Blanchard ordered men from the 1st New Hampshire and some 90 New Yorkers under the command of Captain Folsom and Captain McGinnis to move north up the road and discover the position of the French. As they marched, they could hear the battle unfolding. Folsom and McGinnis decided to abandon their orders of only locating the whereabouts of the enemy and instead assist in the attack and help their fellow soldiers. As they made their way further north, covering about 12 miles, they came upon the scene of the bloody morning scout and several hundred Canadian militia and French native allies, who had retreated from the battle at Johnson's encampment further up the road. They were looting the dead and resting by a small pond. Folsom, with zeal, ordered his men forward and engaged the Canadians and natives. As the New Yorkers came up to aid Folsom's men, they would exchange several volleys with the French forces. The exchange of musketry would go on for roughly an hour, the cost heavy for the unexpecting French irregulars. As Folsom's men started to waver, he ordered his men to rush forward. Intimidated, weary, and fatigued, the remaining Canadians and natives fled the battle. According to local folklore, the battle was so costly that it turned the small pond's water deep red, forever naming the battle Bloody Pond. At the end of the day, Johnson's forces had suffered 154 dead, 103 wounded, and 67 missing, as well as the loss of 60 Mohawk warriors, including Chief Hendrick. Other notable deaths include Colonel Ephraim Williams, Colonel Moses Titcombs, Captain Elijah Hawley, and Captain William McGinnis. Johnson recovered from his wounds, opting to leave the musket ball in. While writing his official report of the battle, Johnson would neglect to mention any of Phineas Lyman or Nathan Whitting's actions during the day. By not mentioning either man's actions, the relationship between the three quickly soured, and even angered Johnson so much that later he renamed Fort Lyman to Fort Edward. Dieskau's losses were comparable. The French had suffered 149 dead, 163 wounded, and 27 captured. Dieskau would survive his wounds and eventually return to France, having fought his last battle. He would die of complications from his wounds in 1767. For logistical reasons, the rest of the Crown Point expedition was never carried out. Provincial enlistments were ending, and the Mohawks were returning home. The British would eventually build Fort William Henry on the site of Johnson's encampment, and the French would construct a fort at the north end of the lake at Carillon, later known as Fort Ticonderoga. While the battle for Lake George was the first major victory for the British power in North America, the war was only just beginning.